A Place Called Home by Laurie Wick. Chapter 21. The scene on the front porch was a peaceful one. Story time was over, and Emily's small head rested on her mother's round stomach. Suzanne's foot kept the porch swing at a steady rock. Emily's eyes slid shut for the last time, and Suzanne's hand moved to stroke her shiny curls. She smiled as she realized it wouldn't bother her in the least to have another little blonde girl. Her other hand moved absently over her stomach. The front door opened and shut quietly. Luke took a seat near the swing and sat in silence, watching his niece sleep. A frown crossed his face when he saw Sue's hand on her abdomen. Luke opened his mouth to speak, but Sue was observant and ready for him. "I'm fine." Luke relaxed and smiled. "Can Mark hide anything from you?" "Nope, not a thing." "How long now?" "Mark says 2 weeks. I say sooner." "He's the doctor." "So he keeps reminding me," Sue answered with a smile and a raise of her eyebrows. Luke laughed softly before asking, "Where is Mark?" Sue nodded her head toward the huge old willow tree that stood some distance off the corner of the porch. Amid bare switches hanging nearly to the ground, Mark and Christine could be seen, and were obviously in deep conversation. "Your grandmother assured me last night when we talked that I have a job and a place to live for an indefinite period of time. It's good to have that worry off my mind. I plan to write Mrs. Hall so her mind is at ease." Mark nodded. "Our sheriff spoke to me about contacting the law in Spooner just so the lines of communication are open. Both towns need to work together on this." Christine shook her head sadly. "I just don't understand. Grandpa was not a wealthy man. I mean, we lived comfortably, and I had all I needed, but it just doesn't make sense." "I must admit it's all rather strange. What we know isn't much. First a note to you from Carl Maxwell, and then the man disappears. And don't forget my grandfather's will, leaving everything to Vince Jeffers in the event of my death. I'm only 19 years old. He would never have written that. Another thing puzzles me. My grandfather's charity. It was never even mentioned. He gave often and quite generously to a small orphanage in Spooner. It just doesn't make sense that he wouldn't even remember them." The two stood together for a moment in thoughtful silence. Mark studied once again the letter in his hand. "Christine," he began gently, "when a person passes away, it's normal for the surviving family members to go through the loved one's possessions. If you were home, I'm sure you would have already started this, painful though it may be." Mark hesitated, wanting to be tactful. "When you write to Mrs. Hall, why not ask her to look through your grandfather's things? I realize this is highly personal, but maybe she can turn up something that will give us some answers." As Mark suspected, Christine did not jump at the idea. It still upset her to think about the finality of her grandfather's death. So Mark hastened to add, "What you write is up to you. You don't have to tell me your decision. It was only a suggestion. And it's all right, though. I'd like to show this if it's all right, though, I'd like to show this letter to the sheriff when I see him." "That's fine, Mark." Christine's voice was preoccupied. "Will you please tell Grandma Em I've gone for a walk and I'll be gone a while?" "Sure, I'll tell her." The words were barely out of his mouth before Christine walked away. The need inside her to escape was so desperate that she nearly ran. Cutting across Mr. Turley's field, her long legs carried her swiftly to a quiet spot along the creek which she had discovered during her first week at Grandma Em's. An enormous boulder at the edge of the water was Christine's destination. Sinking down to it with a weary plop, Christine let the afternoon sun beat upon her. She welcomed its warmth, though it crossed her mind that she should have worn a hat. She studied the backs of her hands. Brown. It was what she got for working in the garden without gloves. A sudden movement interrupted her reverie. Christine's eyes were drawn to the creek's edge. A fish had swum between the rocks and was trapped in a pool barely large enough to hold him. Christine contemplated the situation a moment before reaching out to shift one of the large rocks. The hoped-for result was immediate. With a flip of its tail, the fish headed downstream. With envy, Christine's eyes followed as it moved swiftly out of sight in its newfound freedom. Freedom. It seemed like forever since Christine had experienced that feeling. Freedom to go home if she wanted. Freedom from worries and fears. A freedom that, up until the time of her grandfather's death, she had taken for granted. Christine felt a lonely ache within her. Luke said that God knows everything. Did he know why she sometimes felt empty inside? Did he care? So many questions, but no answers. Christine ached for her grandfather's presence, yet she knew her pride was keeping her from asking for help. So the afternoon shadows lengthened, and Christine sat with only her tears for company. Back at the house, Luke and Silas had their suit coats on and were headed for the door. After kissing Grandma M, Luke handed her a piece of paper. He explained about the verses, and Grandma M assured him that Christine would get them. For Mrs. Hall, Sunday afternoon was usually spent visiting her sister and family. Mrs. Hall's spirits had been up ever since she had heard from Christine, so after a good meal and a visit with her sister, Mrs. Hall started walking out to the Bennet residence with a light step. "Good afternoon, Mrs. Hall." "Oh, Mr. Jeffers, good afternoon to you. It's lovely, is it not?" Mrs. Hall smiled at him. "Yes, indeed it is. May I wish you also a splendid week?" "Why, thank you, Mr. Jeffers." Mrs. Hall continued on her way. Vince sat astride his bay stallion and watched the woman's light step, wondering at her exuberance. She certainly didn't look like the grieving woman he had seen before. Maybe she had had news of Christine. Vince heeled his horse into a walk. He had finally cooled off from his last meeting with that incompetent fool who worked for him. Maybe it was time to send for him again. Once again in the Bennet house, Mrs. Hall hung up her bonnet and changed her shoes. It was then that she put her finger on what was different about Vince Jeffers. She had grown used to his smile, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He was so different from Mr. Bennet that it was a wonder they had ever formed a partnership. But that wasn't it. What was it, then, that was troubling her about him? He had stopped her and talked to her, but didn't even ask after Christine. How odd! Rarely had he ever given her the time of day. Once again, Mrs. Hall experienced that strange feeling that she got whenever she saw Vince Jeffers lately, as if there was something she was supposed to tell him or remember that she couldn't quite come up with. Mrs. Hall did a mental shrug as she reached for a Bible study. Mrs. Hall did a mental shrug as she reached for A Study in Scarlet, the new Sherlock Holmes mystery novel that her sister had just finished. Whatever it was with Vince Jeffers would have to wait until tomorrow.